This is a chef knife, but it's not just any old chef knife, it's a Japanese Kiritsuke. This is an all-purpose knife that was traditionally reserved for the top chef. So what makes this knife so special? Today we're gonna light forge and find out. Let's begin. Alright, so I have a piece of ADCRV2 here. It's a high carbon steel that's similar to 5160 toll steel, which is something I'm used to. I'm gonna go ahead and throw it in the forge and we're gonna begin forging it. A Kiritsuke is a very kind of technically difficult knife to do well, and so that's what I really want to try. See if I can match that standard. So let's do it. I'm pretty pumped. The first challenge is I need to forge this blade as close to shape as possible. In Japanese bladesmithing, it's very important that you have proper geometry during forging, so I have to take my time here. I'm going to start by making the isolation for our tang. I'm going to use a hot cutting tool to make this really sharp, and then I'm going to go to the edge of the anvil and squish this out into the tang material. This makes a really nice sharp transition, as well as providing a little handle I can use my tongs with. The next thing I'm going to do is shorten the piece to a more manageable length. To do this, I'm going to use the same hot cutting tool. I want to be very careful here not to cut off too much material. I can always cut more off later, but I can never add on. Alright, so essentially what I'm trying to do is draw it down into the preform of the blade. This will set me up so that when I go to bevel it, all I'm doing is just simply displacing the material a little bit rather than trying to bevel it while I'm forging out the preform. This is a very critical step, so let's kind of get this right. Alright, so the preform's at a place and I'm happy with it. So now I'm going to start to pull that out into the width that I need for my blade. So let's keep moving. Alright, so what you're seeing me do is take water and put it across the anvil. This is a traditional thing that Japanese smiths would do. Is essentially the vapor that is caused by the hot metal against the water explodes the scale off of it and you're left with this really clean forging surface. That's what I'm going for, is a very clean surface. You'll see why in a little bit, but let's keep working on it and really refine this shape. Let's go. Here you can see me normalizing the blade. I do this for 3 cycles and it helps prepare it for quenching later on. The next step is to profile the blade. I'm going to start out by using my belt grinder before going and doing the traditional way of using a draw file. You'll notice here I'm using a hand file to sort out the profile. I've always found with Japanese blades specifically I can control the profile a lot better if I'm willing to slow down and use a hand tool rather than just go in there with the grinder. Now that the profile's been sorted out though, I'm going to go in now and make the shoulders for the tang. You can see I'm just using a basic Sharpie here, and that's because these don't have to be super precise. I'm going to be recessing this into the handle material, and so while they need to be close, they don't need to be 100% accurate, as you won't actually see them on the finished knife. Something that does need to be accurate though is the distal taper on the blade. I'm going to be using a set of calipers here to basically take measurements at the base of the blade, working my way up to the tip. making sure that it gently tapers. This is crucially important as it'll actually affect how it performs as a kitchen knife. This is a little bit of the precision that you don't typically get to see in my videos. The reality is knife making is a science as much as it is an art form. Speaking of science, I first covered the blade in Sharpie. This allows me to make some layout lines which will help me when I grind my bevel. Keep in mind a Kiritsuke is a single bevel Japanese knife, meaning one side is flat while the other holds a single bevel. It's very important to know what hand this knife is going to be used in, as that determines which side you create that bevel on. In this case, it's going to be a right-handed knife, so the bevel is going on the right side. Now the last step before quenching is to watch me frivolously put clay on the blade. Now I say frivolously because ADCRV2 is not a hamon-friendly steel. Hamons are what you typically see on Japanese swords, which is the differentiation line of a hard edge and a soft spine. This is done by applying clay to the back of the blade and then quenching it. The reason it doesn't work on ADCRV2, which is the steel I'm using here, is because ADCRV2 has different quench properties than the typical steel that you would create hamons with. All this being said, I still felt the need to decoratively apply clay in the off chance that I might create a hamon with it. Hey, I just enjoyed painting some clay on a blade. That's all I can say. Oh my goodness gracious! Don't worry, I am trained professional. Yes, I do this for a living. Now that I nearly blew my hand off, now it's time to go in for the quench. So I'm just going to go into a non-preheated Parks 50. The reason you preheat the oil is so that it increases the quenching speed. And the reason I'm going into Parks 50 that isn't preheated like I typically would is because ADCRV2 actually calls for a slower speed quench oil. Alright, so similar to last video, this time I actually used angle iron, but I slammed it in angle iron after I got done quenching, and that is to hopefully keep the blade straight as it now cools down to room temperature. Alright, so bad news, it does in fact have a pretty significant warp. You can see it there pretty bad, but that is okay, as when we temper it, we can get rid of that. So that's what we're going to tackle next. But first I got to scuff off this flat side so I can see my temper colors. That way I don't accidentally overheat the edge and then lose that nice hard edge that we're wanting. Now what I'm doing here is called blue backing. So essentially I'm tempering the piece, and then I'm going to go one step further by using a torch to heat up the spine of the knife to a blue spring temper, and that'll allow me then to straighten it out in a post vise. Alright, so the next thing we're going to do is do an edge performance test. Now that it's been heat treated completely, now we're going to go ahead, put a piece of steel in the vise, and basically just bash this in to see how the edge geometry holds up right now. Now all that being said, I have not put any sort of edge on it. I'm looking for any sort of deformation along the edges of the steel that we have right now. If they deform, then sure enough the edge will deform. So that's what I'm looking for in this test. And there is absolutely no edge deformation on the piece of steel of the knife, which is great. Now the last thing to do before polishing is finish grinding. For this, I'm going to make sure to keep that flat side flat before going in on the other side and adding my secondary bevel. This will get blended out later during hand sanding. Speaking of hand sanding, what I'm going to do first is start with some 220 grit. This will help me to get the grain all going the same direction on the knife. From there, I'll move on to 400 and then 600, and eventually I'll finish with a 4/0 steel wool and a buffing wheel finish. So now I'm just working on kind of sanding out the choil and the back of the knife. I'm basically just trying to give it a nice sort of half round. That way whenever your finger's resting on it, you don't have any sharp edges that would wear blisters in your hands as you use the knife. You're now seeing me soak the knife in white distilled vinegar. I'm doing this to dissolve the forge scale that was left on the single bevel side of the knife. I want the texture that it has, but I don't want the oxides that are built up on the surface. Once these have been dissolved, I can go over the knife and give it a satin finish for the final product. Well, we definitely know the stupid thing cuts. I just split my finger in half. Ow. You gotta pay attention when you're hand sanding. Once polishing has been finished, now it's time to work on the handle. For this, I'm going to tape up the blade so we don't ruin the surface finish, and then I'm going to cut the wood to length that I'm going to be using. I chose Kokobulo as it's a very dense hardwood, and the style of handle I'm going to be doing is called a wah handle. Alright, so now that my wood has been cut, I then marked it, that way the grain is going the same direction. This is important so that whenever the whole handle is put together, it looks like one solid piece of wood's been used. So now the next step is fitting up this top portion to the shoulders of the blade. But first we need to polish this, as I don't want to fit it up and then have to remove a little bit of material. After the top of this piece has been polished, I now have a solid reference point to make the rest of the handle. I'm going to use a pair of calipers to make sure everything is nice and square to that top point. This is a step that I typically would have skipped out upon several months back. The reality is, you're known for the work that you do, not the work that you can do. And so I've had to tell myself recently that if I don't take the time to do these steps, then I'm not improving. Ultimately, we can't demand perfection from ourselves, but we can demand improvement. And that's all I'm trying to do here, is just be better than I was before. The beautiful thing about being a craftsman is you get to see this tangibly in front of you during your work and from project to project. Alright, now that's been drawn out, what I'm going to do is now go upstairs and use some ball burrs to remove that material so that it snugs down in there really, really neat every time. Let's go do that. See how that looks. Ooh, that's rare. This is the first try. Very cool, very cool. Now that the top two parts of the handle have been fitted, now we have to do the last part. This is the lower portion of the wah handle. As before, I'm going to drill out some pilot holes before fitting it up to the tang of the knife. Now that all the parts have been fitted, now it's time to shape the handle. For this, I'm using a low grit belt on my belt grinder. Super important to wear a respirator here, as hardwoods specifically have a very, very nasty dust that you don't want to breathe in. After the entire handle has been polished, now it's time to do the final step, which is gluing all the pieces together. First, degrease everything with acetone before using an industrial grade epoxy to secure all the parts together. This knife has been a very technically difficult knife to build, but now we'll get to use it and it'll all be worth it. Thank you for being here with me on this journey. And until next time, enjoy this knife. God bless.